The room was already full when the last light disappeared. In a private mansion overlooking the Atlantic cliffs of Newport, Rhode Island, the year was 1897. The windows were shuttered. The heavy doors had closed without ceremony. Well-dressed guests sat upright in their chairs, gloved hands folded, backs straight, eyes open and useless. No candles burned, no lamps glowed. Darkness was complete. No one spoke. The silence was not demanded. It was expected. Breathing could be heard, carefully controlled, deliberately quiet, as if sound itself might invite consequence. Somewhere in the room, someone shifted. The movement stopped almost immediately. Nothing touched them. No voice issued commands. No threat announced itself. And yet fear was present, disciplined, contained, unmistakable. The guests did not know how long they would be left there. They did not know what was being watched or who. What they understood without explanation was this: leaving was not an option. The darkness was not an absence. It was the point. Only later would anyone ask why such nights existed at all. By the final decades of the 19th century, Newport, Rhode Island had ceased to be a town in any meaningful democratic sense. It had become a seasonal stage, a place where America's wealthiest families performed power for one another behind gates, hedges, and stone walls. These were not merely rich people. They were inheritors of railroads, shipping fortunes, industrial monopolies, and financial empires whose origins were already being quietly obscured. Their money preceded memory. Their names carried weight without explanation. The Harrington family belonged to this world. Their estate, like many along Bellevue Avenue, was not designed for comfort. It was designed for distance. From the public, from scrutiny, from consequence. Inside, time moved differently. Servants were trained to appear without presence. Guests learned quickly that curiosity was impolite, and questions were remembered. This elite class existed in a state of near total insulation. Laws were negotiable. Scandals were containable. Reputation functioned as armor. Most importantly, they shared a belief, rarely spoken aloud, but universally practiced. Rules existed for others. Within this closed environment, ordinary entertainments lost their potency. Music, dining, conversation. These were insufficient for people accustomed to absolute deference. Stimulation had to escalate. Control had to become experiential. And so, within drawing rooms and private halls, a different form of amusement began to take shape, one that tested not talent or wit, but obedience. The Harrington gatherings were never announced as experiments. They were framed as evenings of refinement, unusual salons, continental traditions, intellectual amusements. Invitations were handwritten, selective, and deliberately vague. To decline too often was to disappear socially. To inquire too closely was to risk never being invited again. The Candleless nights began simply. Guests were escorted into a formal dining room after dusk. Servants withdrew. The doors closed. Then, without comment, the lights were extinguished. No instructions followed. What made the event disturbing was not darkness itself, but duration. Minutes passed, then longer spans of time, impossible to measure without visual reference. Plates might be present, they might not. No one was told. Some guests attempted conversation. The effort usually died quickly. Words felt exposed. Voices revealed position. Silence became safer. In later variations, subtle disruptions occurred. A chair would be moved. A utensil would disappear. A sound might register from across the room, Not loud enough to identify, not close enough to localize. Nothing overtly threatening occurred. That was essential. The discomfort arose from uncertainty, from the sense of being evaluated rather than attacked. Leaving early was permitted, technically, but those who did were rarely invited again. In Newport society, absence was a form of erasure. Cruelty here was not violent. It was procedural, and because it left no marks, it was never spoken of publicly. Those invited to Harrington events were not naive outsiders. They were senators' wives, bankers' sons, diplomats, industrial heirs, and social climbers on the edge of acceptance. Each understood instinctively what was at stake. To belong was to gain protection. To be excluded was to lose relevance. During Candleless nights, guests reported a peculiar internal conflict. Fear competed with pride. Instinct urged departure. Ambition enforced stillness. Some convinced themselves it was art. Others reframed it as endurance. A few interpreted compliance as proof of sophistication. What none could escape was the imbalance of power. The hosts were unseen. The guests were exposed. Even afterward, conversation avoided specifics. Describing discomfort would imply weakness. Criticizing the Harringtons would imply ingratitude. And so silence compounded itself. Psychological pressure did not end with the evening. It lingered in memories, in reputations, in the knowledge that one's reaction had been observed, judged, catalogued. The true cost of attendance was not fear, it was complicity. The Harrington family did not invent domination, they refined it. Generational wealth had insulated them from ordinary feedback. Disapproval never reached them unfiltered. Consequences were absorbed by intermediaries, lawyers, trustees, institutions. Within such conditions, empathy atrophied. Entertainment shifted from shared pleasure to asymmetric experience. One party acted, the other endured. Observation replaced participation. Control became its own reward. The Candleless nights reveal a deeper pattern common among insulated elites of the era, a fascination with human limits, detached from responsibility. Guests were not seen as equals, they were variables. Importantly, the Harringtons did not view themselves as cruel. They considered themselves curious, observers of character, testers of refinement. Moral language dissolved under the assumption of superiority. This pattern repeats across history wherever wealth becomes hereditary and unchecked. Power seeks sensation. Sensation demands escalation. Escalation requires subjects. By the time discomfort becomes visible, accountability has already vanished. The Candleless nights did not end with exposure. They faded. As the 20th century advanced, external forces intruded. Investigative journalism, social reform movements, economic instability, war. The world beyond the gates grew louder. Privacy became harder to defend. Some practices stopped, others adapted. Many were never recorded. The Harrington name remained intact. No formal accusations were made. No trials occurred. Silence held. Purchased, inherited, enforced, but cultural immunity weakened. After the First World War, displays of aristocratic detachment began to read as indecency rather than refinement. The Great Depression stripped glamour from excess. The language of entitlement lost its certainty. What remained was an uncomfortable historical truth. Power unexamined always experiments on the powerless, quietly, creatively, and without apology. The Candleless nights were not an anomaly. They were a symptom. They remind us that cruelty does not always announce itself, that domination does not require violence, that the most dangerous games are those disguised as tradition. And they warn us, across time that whenever societies stop questioning their elites, darkness does not need candles to return.